The year is 1912. You are on the deck of the brand new luxury liner Titanic as it sets sail from Southampton to New York. You're one of the 20 to 24 passengers and crew on board. Life is good. After 2 days at sea, there is excitement in the air. The ship has just received word that it will arrive in New York a day early. Many passengers, upon hearing this, rush to the rail to get a first glimpse of the land they have been traveling to for weeks. It is then that someone on the lookout shouts, "Iceberg right ahead." The captain turns the wheel, but it is too late. There is a sickening crunch of metal on ice. The ship has struck an iceberg. With many passengers sleeping below deck, the ship remains afloat. But with several compartments breached, water begins to pour in. Passengers are awoken by the rising water and quickly realize that the ship is in grave danger. Lifeboats are scheduled for that evening, so most life jackets are stored below deck. Some passengers don what few life jackets are available, while others fashion makeshift life preservers out of blankets, pillows, and inner tubes. With not enough lifeboats for everyone, some passengers choose to stay on board rather than risk the cold waters of the North Atlantic. Others who do take to the boats are met with frigid temperatures and high winds. One woman in a lifeboat recalls, "I felt the icy water close about me like a vice, and I knew if I didn't get help soon I would die of exposure before morning." Of the nearly 2,200 people on board, only 705 will survive the night. The rest will perish in the frigid waters of the North Atlantic or be lost to the elements as they wait for rescue. The sinking of the Titanic was one of the deadliest disasters in history. What caused it to sink, and why does the story continue to fascinate us more than 100 years later? Hi and welcome to this channel. Today we'll be taking a look at the sinking of the Titanic. For decades following the sinking of the Titanic, stories were told of an unsinkable ship that had gone down in the North Atlantic. But was the Titanic truly unsinkable? For those who rode on the Titanic, the idea of the ship sinking never crossed their minds, and for good reason. The Titanic was the largest ship in the world at the time and boasted many advanced safety features, including watertight compartments. If the ship did spring a leak, these compartments would keep the water contained and the ship afloat. Additionally, the Titanic had double-layered steel hulls, and new safety regulations required that all ships be equipped with lifeboats, although the Titanic did not have enough for all passengers and crew. Finally, the Titanic had a nearby lifeboat station, which made it even less likely that the ship would sink. So how did the Titanic sink? On April 14, 1912, at 11:40 p.m., the Titanic struck an iceberg on the starboard side or right side of the ship. This was around 7.5 miles off the coast of the small town of Nantucket, Massachusetts. At the time, the ship was moving 23 knots or 26 miles per hour. The ship's hull was made up of 16 watertight compartments. While the exact number of compartments breached is unknown, most historians agree that 5 or 6 were compromised, causing the ship to fill with water and slowly sink. Why did the Titanic sink so quickly? Once the Titanic had struck the iceberg, the crew realized that the ship was in danger. Lifeboats were distributed among the panicked passengers and crew, and passengers were instructed to put on life jackets. A lifeboat was scheduled for that night, but no one could have anticipated that the ship would sink before it took place. What caused the Titanic to sink was the combination of 3 factors. First was the speed of the ship. Had the Titanic been traveling at a slower speed, it may have been able to avoid the iceberg altogether. Second was the size of the iceberg. Icebergs in the area were notoriously large, and this one was no exception. Finally, it was the lack of proper lookout. The ship had 2 lookouts, but they were not properly equipped with binoculars. Had they had binoculars, they may have spotted the iceberg sooner. Who was responsible for the sinking of the Titanic? Many investigations into the sinking of the Titanic determined that the crew was at fault for the disaster. The lookouts should have seen the iceberg sooner, and Captain Edward J. Smith should have slowed the ship once the iceberg was spotted. However, a number of contributing factors led to the sinking of the Titanic. These included the lack of proper lifeboats, the assumption that the Titanic was unsinkable, and the lack of regulation in the shipping industry at the time. In fact, the captain of the nearby ship, the captain of the lifeboat, had repeatedly warned ships in the area about the icebergs, but no one had listened. What happened to the passengers and crew of the Titanic? Of the 24 passengers and crew on board the Titanic when it sank, only 705 survived. A lifeboat arrived on the scene around AM, but with so many people on board and not enough lifeboats, the majority of passengers and crew did not make it off the ship. Of the survivors, most had been in the water for hours and were suffering from exposure. The captain of the lifeboat estimated that most people would not have survived more than 15 minutes in the freezing water. Several passengers who had made it into the lifeboats froze to death shortly after being rescued. All told, 1,517 people perished in the sinking of the Titanic. Did the Titanic have lifeboats? The Titanic did have lifeboats, but not enough for all passengers and crew. In fact, the ship was supposed to be getting more that evening. When the Titanic struck the iceberg, the crew began handing out the lifeboats. Many people refused to leave the ship, believing that it would not sink. Others did grab lifeboats, but they were of poor quality. They were old and in rough shape and did not keep people afloat very well. Still others fashioned makeshift life preservers out of blankets, pillows, and inner tubes. With the suddenness of the disaster, most people did not have time to grab lifeboats or get into the lifeboats that were provided. Did the lifeboat arrive on time? A nearby lifeboat was scheduled for that evening, but it arrived too late to save many people. In fact, many people had already frozen to death by the time the lifeboat arrived. Why does the story of the Titanic still fascinate us today? The story of the Titanic fascinates us because it is a story of human nature. It is a story of hubris and the dangers of man versus machine. The Titanic was the largest ship in the world and was considered to be unsinkable, yet it sank and more than 1,500 people died. The story of the Titanic also fascinates us because it is a story of survival. Of the nearly 2,200 people on board, only 700 survived. These were ordinary people who found themselves in an extraordinary situation, and most of them survived. Finally, the story of the Titanic fascinates us because it is a story of tragedy. This was a needless disaster that could have been avoided had the ship been traveling at a slower speed, had the lookouts had binoculars, or had the captain heeded the warnings of other ships in the area. It's hard to believe that it's been over 100 years since the sinking of the Titanic. And yet the story continues to fascinate us. Perhaps it is because the Titanic represents the ultimate hubris, a ship that was thought to be unsinkable, yet sank and took more than 1,500 people with it to the bottom of the ocean. Or perhaps it is the story of survival that fascinates us, of the nearly 2,200 people. On board, only 700 survived. These were ordinary people who found themselves in an extraordinary situation, and most of them survived. Whatever the reason, the story of the Titanic continues to fascinate us more than 100 years later. Thank you for watching this video. Do you find the story of the Titanic fascinating? Why or why not? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more videos like this one.